She came back from the gate with a suitcase and a smile that had the practiced ease of someone telling the easiest lie they had ever learned to wear. And the moment I saw her walk out of the sliding doors with the bright business class tag still looped on the handle, and the way she hugged her phone to her chest like it was a small animal, I felt a cold clarity cut through me so sharply that it left my hands numb. Because I had not been at home that week wondering where she was for nothing. I had tracked every transfer, every seat assignment, and I had watched the little blue that represented her flight move across the map in real time like a slow, inevitable confession. And when she met my eyes and said in a long, careful sentence about how the conference had been exhausting but productive and how grateful she was to have had the space to meet a potential client who could open doors for her, the words hit me like a polished stone skipped across a dark river because the tone was the same she used when she wanted me to believe that the small deceptions were simply trade-offs for ambition. And I knew in that hollow ring of recognition that this was the moment where I either swallowed the ache and pretended ignorance for the rest of my life, or I let the ache sharpen into something that would not be soothed by silence. You have to understand that none of what followed sprang from some sudden, cinematic revelation. The suspicion had been a slow drumbeat beneath daily life, a cadence that built from small misalignments. A credit card charge from a restaurant whose name didn't appear on any conference agenda. A photo she posted that was cropped in a way that clipped out faces, the way she described a late-night meeting with an editor when she had actually been seen laughing with someone who did not appear in her retouched images. And every time I raised a gently curious question, she answered in long sentences that were full of plausible professional detail. Sentences like, "We were hashing out the logistics of a joint venture, and he insisted we move to a quieter place to go over the projection model. So we went to the hotel's lounge to finish the numbers because he was staying at the same hotel, and it was easier that way." And the smoothness of those explanations was meant to be a salve that would soothe suspicion rather than a truth I could test. And I let it be a salve for a while, because the alternative was uglier than my imagination wanted to admit. I booked the next flight with the kind of mechanical calm that only someone who has turned anger into procedure can manage. I told myself it was about gathering facts, not about setting a trap, but the rehearsed cool was part of the plan because rage makes people clumsy and I needed to be precise. So I arranged a late morning ticket to the same city she had named in her emails. I checked into a hotel 2 blocks from the conference center under my own name, and then, without theatrics, without the kind of noisy bravado people confuse with courage, I walked to the lobby of the hotel she had claimed she was using and paid a man at the front desk a long, conversational line about how I liked the city, how the conference seemed like a valuable networking opportunity for the type of work she did. And I asked in a voice that was steady and the sort you use when you are mapping out the beginning of something that you do not yet want to name, whether they could tell me which rooms were usually booked by visiting delegates, because I felt a small, personal curiosity about the place where she had been excited about meeting potential partners. The clerk, obliging and unaware that his ease with hotel routines was sealing a small, private conspiracy, gave me the floor plan, the general floors where business travelers tended to stay, and a plate of names on a clipboard that I examined with the patience of a man who had decided to spend the day simply watching a door. When I say I staked out the hotel, imagine not the movie stakeout with a camera and a siren, but the patient, almost domestic stillness of someone who has chosen the slow work of observation. I sat at the cafe 2 blocks down with a paper I did not read. I ordered coffee 3 times and let the cup cool while I watched the revolving doors. And sometimes I took long walks along the river, so that when she stepped into the street the way she had always walked between sessions, I looked up and allowed my eyes to meet hers and to register the small, infuriating details. A ribbon of red lipstick on her teeth, the way her bag swung as if it contained more than a laptop, the faint smell of someone else's cologne at the hem of her scarf. And every time she passed my line of sight, I could feel the work of cataloging begin. I was assembling a ledger of her movements because I had decided that if something was going to be taken from me, I would have the record of it, and I would not have to rely on memory. The thing about human deceit is that it tries to be invisible. It depends on the inertia of other people's trust to go unnoticed, and the hotel had been the perfect ally in that invisibility because rooms are private by design and hotel staff are trained to fold themselves into the background. But the neighboring door, the one next to hers, was not a silent gap so much as a punctuation mark in the narrative. An ordinary threshold that in the right hands becomes the storyteller's most effective prop. I had no right, at first blush, to the neighbor's room, but I had the patience to learn what a neighbor's room could reveal. The comings and goings of a door that opens at odd hours, the soft signature of two voices that do not belong in the same professional sentence, the way a hallway echoes differently when it carries laughter that has nothing to do with networking dinners and everything to do with intimacy. I kept a distance because I wanted proof, not a confession, and proof would not be found in a confrontation in a dim bar, but in the small, irrefutable signs that collect around a place when truth is allowed to show itself. A pair of shoes that don't belong in a suitcase meant for a solo trip. The silhouette of a man's profile that slips into a room carrying a newspaper, and a familiarity that is not the careful politeness of strangers, and the scent left on a pillowcase that does not match the perfumes listed on any travel receipt. On the second evening, when the sun had thinned to a gray wash and the hotel bar hummed with the low music of strangers pretending to relax, the door 3 down from hers opened, and a man came out in a shirt that looked like it had been chosen casually, but with the ease of a man who has entered this choreography often enough to know the exact cadence of greetings. And he didn't look like a colleague to me because of the small way he carried his glass and the way his hand rested on the doorknob for a second longer than one would if he were merely closing a door on a business meeting. And when he shut the door behind him, I felt, with a quiet, animal certainty, that the ledger was beginning to fill with more than asterisks and suppositions. I would not storm his room. I would not shout or throw suitcases or stage any of the melodramas I knew people imagined when they thought of revenge. Instead, I let the hotel do what hotels do best, which is to be the setting where private things are allowed to happen without witnesses, and I counted the hours like someone cataloging a season because I had decided that the only way to make a lie visible was to let all its tiny, innocent components be visible together, and for that you need time. The unglamorous watchfulness that takes root in the bones. There were moments that the long observing afforded me that I had not anticipated. The way she laughed with a softness that belonged to a different life than the disciplined entrepreneur she had curated online. The private cadence of her sentences when she spoke to someone who did not need the armor of professional language. The tilt of her head when she listened to a man tell a joke, and the way her hand sought his across a table like a small, automatic answer to loneliness, and each of those moments landed in me not as a single, explosive point, but as a slow accumulation of evidence that became, in my head, a clean, terrible math. Time spent, the lie told, the likeness of their familiarity multiplied across days. I wrote notes in my phone with the awkwardness of someone recording what they had watched while pretending indifference in public spaces. I documented times and faces and the tone of sentences, and when she looked at me across the hotel lobby and said in a long, disarming paragraph about how this trip had been life-changing because of the contacts she had made and the way she could finally see how to scale a project she believed in, I heard the practiced cadence and felt the knowledge that now I could hold the record if I chose to, and the choice, in that precise second, felt like a small, decisive revolution against the quiet theft that had been happening while I had been asked to applaud. The moment everything shifted did not arrive with a shout or a thrown glass. It arrived like the slow, resolute closing of a book on a long, patient deception, and I remember the precise sequence because memory loves the points that change a life. I had been sitting across from the hotel bar, a coffee gone cold by the time my attention stopped pretending to be casual, watching the revolving doors without reading the news on my phone, and she walked in with that same easy, rehearsed smile she had used on the plane and in video calls and at family gatherings. A smile that had been polished so often it had lost any edge of surprise, and she moved through the room with a cadence that made people look up because she carried herself like someone who believed her own press releases. But I saw something different in the way her shoulders relaxed, and in the way she crossed to a table near the window where a man I had not yet cataloged sat already with his coat draped over the chair and a newspaper folded in a way that suggested he had been waiting for more than just coffee. And when she slid into the chair opposite him, they did not talk in clipped, professional sentences, but in the soft, looping paragraphs of people who share a private language, and the bar noise folded around them like a curtain until the world outside that table ceased to matter. I felt myself hold my breath not because some wild scene had erupted, but because what unfolded was worse in its ordinariness. The casual way his hand found the back of her chair, the long sentence she said that included, in a voice that curved with fondness rather than transactional neutrality. I wish we had more time to talk about this without the conference looming. And the man answering in a long, warm string of words that suggested familiarity and mutual affection rather than a partnership confined to PowerPoint slides and budget forecasts. And what snapped inside me was neither the sight of them together nor the little touches that could be forgiven as loneliness seeking comfort, but the way she looked at him in that moment, in a gaze full of soft complicity that belonged to lovers who had learned each other's stories by heart. And a cold rage reared up in me, because I finally understood that the narrative she had been feeding me about late meetings and networking drinks had been a theater for her to practice a different life, in private, while leaving me to applaud from the cheap seats. I remember rising from my chair because the act of standing felt like a tiny rebellion that I needed to commit to before my hands could betray me with trembling, and I walked closer, as if to be casual, which is to say I walked like a man who has decided that observation is his weapon and occupies himself with small, deliberate motions so that he does not allow immediate fury to lower his aim. And I heard her say in a long sentence about how grateful she was that someone in the city had taken the time to sit with her and explain how to scale her idea, and he answered in paragraphs about logistics and timelines, and the ways their conversations had often wandered from work into the small, unplanned things that make people friends, and then something more, because familiarity, when it is allowed to breathe for long enough, drifts toward intimacy by degrees most people count as harmless until one morning they find themselves entangled in a life they did not plan to inhabit. And in that moment I felt the weight of every detail I had ignored, the unexplained hotel receipts, the last-minute itinerary changes she described in long, clinical emails as adjustments for a client, the photos cropped so carefully that faces were erased like inconvenient footnotes, and the knowledge that I had been patient turned into a bitter, active thing inside me. A decision forming that this would not be another quiet erasure where I pretended not to notice, because pretending had become the way my life was being taken from me in small increments. I did not confront them then because immediate confrontation is the theater of the unprepared, and I had learned in the months of quiet noticing that when people are given the chance to shout louder than evidence, they will, with great skill, construct a drama that paints the other as unstable and themselves as wronged, which is why I sat at a nearby table and ordered the same drink she liked, and I let the time pass like a slow pulse, cataloging instead of accusing, because I needed more than the sight of two people smiling at each other across a table. I needed the ledger of their ordinary minutes to be precise enough to read in a meeting of relatives and witnesses, because a single moment of indiscretion can be described away, but an accumulation of small, undeniable details becomes a pattern that resists eloquent denial. And as I watched them stand, link arms in a way that was not necessary for crossing a small stream, but necessary for the private choreography they had practiced, and I watched them walk toward the corridor where the names were tucked behind a number on a plastic keycard, the decision that had been forming inside me completed itself with a clarity that was almost clinical. I would not stumble into private argument. I would produce the facts, a slow and unarguable stack of them, in a place where she had used appearances to build a myth, and I would make that myth fall in front of the people who had been asked to buy into it. Later, when she called me in her long, measured sentences that were designed to soothe and redirect and make the listener complicit in believing, she said things like, "We had such a productive conversation, and these people have so many ideas about how to scale things if we move carefully." And when I asked, in a voice that tried to remain as even and long as possible, about who these people were and whether she had mentioned our plans for transparency, she gave me an answer that was all soft edges and plausible business speak that slid off the truth like oil off a skillet. And for the first time I interrupted her not with a question, but with a statement in a long, deliberate voice that held my accumulation of observation like a ledger I was opening across the kitchen table, and I told her, in that long sentence, that I had seen her that afternoon, and that she had been sitting with a man who stayed in the room next to hers, and whose hand found the small of her back with a familiarity that did not belong in a professional meeting. And when she paused in a breathless arc of denial that started long and splintered into excuses about exhaustion and confusion and stress, I felt the lightness drain from the conversation because her defenses operated on the economy of charm and distraction, and she immediately sought to recast the scene in terms that would elicit sympathy and reluctance to escalate from me, which is the tactic people use when they want the record of their lives to be a story told in selected highlights rather than in full ledger form. That was the breaking point, not because an image had been seen, but because of the choice I made after seeing it. I decided then that I would not be the man who forgave in private and then paid for the lie publicly with time and trust siphoned out of our life together. And I decided with a cold, patient clarity that revenge, if one must call it that, would not be violent or petty but precise and irrevocable in its clarity. Because the only thing worse than being cheated on is to have that cheating narratively erase you so smoothly that you cannot prove it to anyone but yourself. And I wanted proof that could be presented without ornament in a room where our shared community held weight, where the family members who had nodded along to her Fitspo posts and her talk of late meetings could see the ledger for what it was. And when she began to cry in a long, looping confession that tried to turn the conversation toward our history and the ways in which we had both been stretched thin by work and parenting and the slow rot of small resentments, I listened in long, measured silence, and then hung up because I needed time to let a plan assemble into something that would not be a scene of rage, but a demonstration of evidence. And I walked out into the city night in a long, cold line of thoughts that had nothing to do with immediate spectacle, but everything to do with the slower work of assembling a truth that would not be easily disputed. I did not want theater. I wanted a ledger, a slow, undeniable accounting of time and choice. And so the plan I built was less about dramatic spectacle and more about patience, about fitting myself into the background where the smallest human details could become the loudest evidence. So I booked the room next to hers without fanfare and under a name that sounded ordinary enough for a front desk clerk to register without curiosity, and I told myself, as I signed the card and took the key, that this was not a trap sprung by one impulsive night, but a careful tending to a truth I had been letting slide for too long, and that the work of observation would have to be as steady and unexcitable as the clock on a mantle if it was to be useful later in a conversation that would not be decided by heat, but by facts. I chose a room with a connecting corridor rather than a balcony because I wanted the possibility of seeing small motions in the hall, shoes left outside a door, a scarf hung on a doorknob, the way the light under the frame told you if someone had come back late. Details that a person spinning a lie often forget to manage because their attention is on the performance rather than the practical marks they leave behind. And I rehearsed the low, domestic acts that would make me invisible, long breakfasts at the cafe downstairs, afternoons with a newspaper I would not read, slow walks along the river that kept me within sight, but never so close that an accusation could be hurled without witnesses to temper it. I told the concierge I liked to work from comfortable lobbies when I traveled for business, and in a voice that was even and conversational, I asked for the quietest table near the reception because I wanted to be able to look up without seeming to stare, and he obligingly offered me a corner seat with a view of 3 doors on the second floor and a soft, conspiratorial smile that trusted the anonymity of hotels. He did not know he had assisted in a private accounting, only that the guest had a preference. I did not bribe or threaten or try to access closed logs. I only made myself present and routine, because normality is the best camouflage, and because I wanted nothing that could later be dismissed as manipulation. No hidden cameras installed, no forged receipts, nothing illegal. Only time-stamped photos I could take from public spaces, the receipts for coffees and meals that tied me to my time frame, and my own written record, neat and unornamented, that would show dates, times, and the ordinary human moments that, strung together, would form a pattern both accidental and damning. When I ran through the plan in my head, it had the clean geometry of a blueprint. Stay visible, but not aggressive. Gather simple artifacts a court of reason could not ignore. Elicit no confession in the moment, because a confession can be performed as easily as a denial. And what I needed was the quieter thing, an accumulation that could not be explained away through charm or tears because it existed in invoices, timestamps, and photographs taken from lobbies and public corridors. I told myself I would not be cruel in the way that aims merely to wound. I wanted to illuminate, not torture. Still, I acknowledged privately that there would be cruelty inherent in removing the soft camouflage she had worn for months, and the plan accounted for that too, because if I was going to expose a life built on small deceptions, I would do it in a way that left no ambiguity about what I found and why it mattered to me. Not for the sake of revenge as spectacle, but to reclaim my nights and the ordinary trust that had been consumed by her rehearsed absences. To that end, I set up a simple method of keeping time. Notes in my phone with exact minutes. Photos snapped with the hotel lobby clock in frame. A small string of emails I sent to myself with short summaries of where she had been and what I had observed, and I printed nothing yet, because printing makes things look like theater, and I wanted the discovery to be slow and inexorable rather than theatrical. And in the pauses between observations, I practiced the long sentences I would use when I finally spoke. Because when you plan to break something that has been built from lies, you cannot rely on venom or shorthand. Instead, you must speak with a voice that invites attention and makes a record without relying on the theatrics that can be dismissed as rage. There were practical conversations I had to have and gentle manipulations I needed to perform that were not illegal, but required an economy of trust. I called a mutual friend under the guise of curiosity about the city and asked if they might pop by the conference center for a coffee, because I wanted a familiar face around. They agreed without question because we had traveled together before, and because my tone suggested nothing unusual, and their presence later, an ordinary stranger who happened to recognize a familiar face, was useful because eyewitness accounts are messy but human, and a friend who could later corroborate the cadence of what I had observed would lend a texture to the record that a photo alone cannot provide. I also spoke with the barista at the cafe in a long, friendly sentence about how I loved their tea and that I would be a regular for a few days, and the barista smiled and learned my face. I told myself these small human exchanges were not manipulations so much as the creation of a reasonable context in which my own presence made sense, a man quietly working nearby rather than someone glaring from a car. And anyone who watched without understanding the private calculus would see only a solitary traveler and not a man writing a ledger of betrayal. On the night I judged the risk lowest for rash moves and highest for observation, I took one careful step further. I moved my room key to a small fold of wallet so that I could step into the corridor with an excuse to take the elevator down for fresh air, and in doing so I allowed myself to pass within casual view of her door in a way that would let me notice the small domestic artifacts people leave at thresholds. The faint scuff of a shoe, a loop where a scarf had been hung, a damp patch in the mat perhaps from a hasty arrival, and I recorded those with unflashy photos taken with my phone aimed honestly at the numbers on the doors, so there would be no confusion later about which doorway had shown what sign. Again, there was a discipline to this, a refusal to engage in anything clandestine that could later be explained as manipulation, because the last thing I wanted was for someone to say I had staged the evidence when the truth was simply that I had been patient and had learned to read the small marks people leave on the world when they inhabit two lives. At the same time, I prepared the endgame with the same quiet exactitude. I would not confront her in a febrile hallway, and I would not demand confession in a state of collapsed dignity, because those scenes are easily redirected into narratives where the accuser looks unhinged and the accused, if clever, can play victim. So I chose instead a public, but controlled place for the reveal. A breakfast with a cousin we both trusted who had a calm voice and a sense of proportion, someone who would not be tempted to clap or to bay for spectacle, but who would, in long measured sentences, ask questions that required answers and would listen without theatrics, because the family is often the jury we both wanted and feared, and I needed a witness with a temperament that would make the facts land hard. I typed, in a long, plain message, the words I would send to that cousin if the ledger matched what I suspected. Can you meet me for breakfast? There's something I need you to see. I want you to know what happened before I say anything to anyone else. The message was innocuous and human, and when the cousin said yes without hesitance, I felt the plan coalesce into a single practical shape. Patient documentation followed by a measured, public conversation where the accumulation of ordinary evidence would be allowed to speak aloud in front of someone who had the capacity to hear it calmly. I rehearsed language that was long and precise, devoid of invective because invective provides targets for diversion, and I wrote the paragraphs I would read if the moment demanded it, statements that laid out times, dates, and places with the cold clarity of someone reading a ledger so that no one could conflate my intention with malice. On Tuesday, at 7:12 p.m., she entered the hotel bar with a man I later learned stayed in the room next to hers, and that same man was captured on my phone leaving the room at 10:45 p.m. On Thursday, I have the timestamps and the photos, and I am not interested in a dramatic scene, only in clarifying what has been happening because I cannot be the only person whose nights are being reshaped by this pattern. The words were clinical and long and written to do one thing: to make denial difficult and to invite a calm accounting rather than a war, because I wanted the consequence to be clear and final without the excess of vindictiveness that satisfies for a moment but fractures the person who wields it more than the one who deserved it. When the morning came, I felt the peculiar quiet that precedes something you have arranged so carefully that the world almost seems to take a breath to let it happen. I dressed in clothes that announced nothing. No suit, no armor, merely a shirt and jacket that would look ordinary in a cafe full of weekend travelers. And as I walked toward the place where my cousin had agreed to meet, I carried in my pocket the small archive that would determine how the conversation unfolded, a sequence of photos, with lobby clocks in the frames, notes with times written in a steady hand, a handful of coffee receipts that matched the hours I had logged, and an unspoken readiness not to rage but to reveal, because I had learned that rage sharpens in a spectacle while revelation solidifies into a record. The cafe was warm with steam and the sound of cups. My cousin arrived with a long, easy hug and a look of concern that did not ask for explanation. And when we sat down, I unfolded the folder in one long motion that felt almost ceremonial in its ordinariness and said, in a voice that I had practiced until it sounded like fact and not fury, "I want you to look at these and tell me if I'm being unreasonable to ask for clarity." And I placed in front of them the first photograph, which showed her, with the same hair, the same coat, the same impossible half-smile that had convinced me for so long of the performance. And I watched my cousin's face move from curiosity through the mild disbelief people afford acquaintances and into the slow recognition that happens when someone sees a pattern rather than an accident. And they leaned in and read aloud, in a long, even sentence that made my chest ache with relief at its calmness, the times and the numbered doors and the small, precise things that only patience had given me the right to record. We did not need to rehearse the way the evidence spoke because the photographs and timestamps had the blunt authority of facts. And after a series of long, quiet paragraphs in which my cousin asked questions that were precise and unshouted, questions about whether I had confronted her privately first, about what I hoped to achieve by showing these to family, about whether I wanted separation or honesty, I said in a long, patient sentence that I had confronted her once, that she had given me the familiar vocabulary of apology and explanation, that for months she had offered me plausible professional reasons for absences that now, seen alongside these records, had the brittle taste of rehearsed narratives, and that I could not sleep under the weight of a life narrated for me by someone else, which is why I had to assemble the facts and bring them to people who had been asked to believe without seeing. My cousin listened and then, in a long string of measured speech, suggested a concrete step. "Tell me what you want me to do next." And the simplicity of the request made my plan real, because I had chosen this exact cousin for their capacity to balance empathy with directness. And I said, in words that had been written in my head a dozen times over, "Come with me for breakfast with her parents and bring the folder. I don't want a fight in a hallway. I want a conversation with witnesses present, and with a chance for her to answer these specifics without hiding behind charm." We went to her parents' house because I needed the people who had been most impressed by her narrative to see the ledger in daylight. And when we arrived, I felt the peculiar load of walking into the living room where stories had once been told in comfortable tones and where now the same furniture seemed to sit under the weight of expectation. And her mother greeted us with a long, warm paragraph about hospitality and family that began with tea and ended with a question about whether everything was all right. And at that point, I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it slowly because the act of unfastening a folder is itself a long, unhurried sentence that tells people this is not a theatrically hasty accusation, but a patient account of time. As my cousin spoke in long, careful words about how they had seen nothing themselves, but had noticed the way our schedules had shifted, and as her mother moved from polite concern to a long, puzzled inquiry about the details, I felt the room tilt. You could see the way memories rearranged themselves on the faces of family members who had been asked to admire a narrative suddenly confronted with evidence that made that admiration feel premature. Then she arrived at her parents like someone walking into the middle of an argument she had not anticipated, and she entered with the slow, practiced composure of someone who had long performed an identity for the benefit of family. And when she saw the folder on the coffee table, a flicker of something transient passed across her face. Surprise. Then the kind of composure that slides into a long, constructed speech designed to soothe. And she began, in a sentence that had the softness of a performance meant to calm, to say that she had been under a lot of pressure and that sometimes business requires privacy, and that she had not intended to be secretive, but rather to protect the fragile seeds of an opportunity. And her voice was long and lithe with the particular cadence of someone who had rehearsed apologies before. I let her speak a long time, and when she paused, I placed my own hand on the open photograph and said, in an extended, steady voice that filled the small room without shouting, "These are dates and times and doors, and your explanation of privacy doesn't account for the small, human things that matter in a marriage, like where you spend nights, whose laughter you share, and how you talk through decisions that affect the home we built together." And the sentence was long because the weight of ordinary life cannot be sketched in fragments, and because I wanted the family to hear not the theatrical passion of a man scorned but the calm, exhausted account of someone whose nights had been consumed by another person's rehearsed absences. She tried to reply in a long, winding string of words that reached for sympathy and history, that rehashed sleepless years and parenting stress and the sheer difficulty of balancing ambition and family life. And there were lines in her speech that were true and many that were wounded into performance. And I listened not to the parts that a clever rhetorician could spin into self-justification, but to the smallest, weakest points where her sentences faltered and where the details I had collected did not fold into the story she told, because the fissures were where truth could find purchase. And at one moment, when she spoke in a breathless, continuing sentence about how she had felt alone and how the other person had simply been someone who listened and offered perspective, her mother, with a long, slow gravity in her voice that carried more disappointment than anger, said in a paragraph that the family had built its admiration on a public set of performances, and that admiration required a measure of honesty, and that honest reckoning did not mean casting blame without hearing, but also did not mean accepting evasions when facts had been documented. What I had not fully prepared for was the particular cruelty of watching someone you once loved attempt to convert fact into feeling and vice versa, and to see in the faces of people you both knew the exact moment where trust reoriented itself like a compass needle. Some leaned toward me with the careful respect of those who value evidence. Others tilted toward her with the soft suspicion of those who would rather protect a loved one until betrayal is asserted beyond doubt. And yet the ledger, those photos, those times, those small, public receipts, kept a steady gravity that pulled the conversation into the practical zone where charm could not follow. And when she finally, in a long and uneven sentence that trembled with the human weight of someone who had been found out, and yet had learned 1,000 small, practiced ways to beg for understanding, asked if forgiveness was possible, the question landed like an offering on a table now crowded with the visible record of her absences. There was a moment, long and slow and utterly ordinary, when I felt the brittle relief of having moved from suspicion to demonstration. I watched her parents exchange a paragraph of hushed questions, and then the father said in a long, even tone that he needed time to think because truth, once revealed, demands slow reconsideration. And in that measured pause, I felt the execution of my plan complete, not because I had exposed her and exacted drama, but because I had placed the ledger in a family room and let witness do what evidence cannot. Make people reconfigure how they remember a person. She left that day with a bag at her shoulder and a long string of promises that came in lengthy, tearful paragraphs about counseling and honest conversation. And when she hugged me at the doorway, she whispered in a breathless, complicated sentence that tried to fold apology and plea together. "I never meant to hurt you like this, but I was lost, and I thought I was doing what I needed to do." And even in the softness of her words, I felt the cool clarity that comes after action. The plan had been executed with the patience of ledger and witness rather than the clatter of spectacle, And the truth, once it has a room to inhabit and witnesses to attest to it, has a way of unmaking the small performances that require an audience to survive. The weeks that followed the breakfast with the folder unfolded in a way that felt less like fireworks and more like the slow, unsettling settling of dust after a window has been opened, because there was no single catastrophic moment that finished everything. There was instead a series of long, mundane reckonings that stacked up until the shape of our lives had to change to accommodate the new facts. And the first consequence was domestic and ordinary. She moved out of our shared apartment with the steady, efficient bureaucracy of someone who had rehearsed departures before, and as she packed in long, careful sentences about what she would take and what I should keep, she spoke in a tone that was both unflinchingly practical and hollow with emotion, saying things like, "I will take the blue kettle because it belonged to my grandmother, and it helps me remember mornings before everything got complicated. And you keep the bookcase because you read in the evenings, and I would rather not change that small comfort for either of us." And when I answered in a long, even voice that attempted to hold the practical seams of coexistence in place, I felt the strange contract of adulthood settle between us. Logistics, schedules, and precise arrangements rather than the explosive drama I had feared or the melodramatic vengeance some imagined when they heard the bare outline of what had happened. And in that ordinary ledger of who takes what and who keeps which keys, there was a strange, quiet dignity to being dispassionate, though it did not undo the ache that had set into the quieter hours. Family relationships rearrange themselves in slow, sometimes brutal ways because people need time to reframe what they think they know about someone they love, and some relatives closed ranks around her with long, patient questions and cautious visits that tried to reconcile the woman they wanted to protect with the ledger they had seen, while others, who had once admired her performative discipline and had been quietly irritated when their own attempts at fitness were overshadowed by her curated victories, found it easier to align with the facts I presented and offered practical support in long forms of help, such as offering a room for a few weeks or sitting with me over coffee in conversations that stretched into paragraphs about how to manage public perception and next steps. And I learned, in those slow dialogues, that people do not become saints or monsters overnight, but rather negotiate loyalties in long, careful sentences that reveal more about their need for stability than about their judgment of my actions. There were friends who stopped calling and friends who called more often in long, awkward strings of concern. And at neighborhood gatherings where we once nodded across the fence, there was a new, thin air where people measured their words before speaking. Strangers on social media, once fond of her curated posts, now asked questions in long comments that seemed to hunt for clarity, while others offered curt, black-and-white judgments in short, explosive bursts, and I found myself reading messages that praised my courage in long, effusive paragraphs and others that condemned me in a single sharp line, which made the landscape of public opinion feel like an echo chamber that reflected as much about the commentators as it did about the facts of what had happened. She attended therapy on and off in the following months, and when I asked her, in a long, careful conversation that we held, because we both understood the pragmatic need to coordinate arrangements for shared responsibilities, about whether anything she said in those sessions might help us to understand the emptiness that had driven her into a pattern of lying, she told me in a breathy, extended sentence that was part confession and part explanation that she had been ashamed of how small her victories felt in the shadow of the life she thought she should be building, and that the other person had listened in a way that, for reasons she could not fully explain without invoking old wounds, felt like rescue. And the words, long and tangled, did little to soothe the ledger of evidence that had brought us to that point, but did furnish me with a human texture I had not allowed myself to admit I wanted. Not absolution, not necessarily, but a sense that the person who had been capable of the deception was not a cartoon villain but a human who had been trying, in a flawed and damaging way, to become someone else. Her parents, when I saw them again in a long, carefully arranged meeting at a neutral cafe, spoke in extended sentences about how the revelation had been a form of grief for them because they had to reconcile their image of a daughter with the documentary reality we had placed before them. And their voices carried the tired patience of people who love someone enough to be furious and still want to find a way back to humane regard if possible, which complicated the sense of triumph I sometimes Felt because if family wanted to forgive, then the ledger becomes a tool of clarification rather than annihilation. Practical matters required attention too. We separated finances and formalized who would be responsible for which bills and long, legally worded documents that both of us read and signed over a series of afternoons that felt more like a bureaucratic unraveling than a melodramatic court scene. And I hired a lawyer not because I wanted to escalate, but because I wanted an efficient, unemotional way to make sure that our contractual responsibilities were fair and clear. The legal steps were dry and tedious and yet necessary. And in those long, punctuated hours of signing and initialing, I found a different kind of calm, an adulter's calm, that comes from converting emotional chaos into clear steps so that you can sleep at night without the mind inventing alternate realities to terrify you. And that practical calm carried a small, steady satisfaction because it meant I had reclaimed a portion of the life logistics that had been shifted without my consent. Emotionally, the aftermath was not the cinematic triumph some people imagine when they hear the outline of a revenge story. Satisfaction arrived as a narrow, precise thing that fit into the hand like a small coin rather than a fanfare. And the first time I allowed myself to feel that coin fully was when, alone in our living room after the movers had taken the last box and the apartment no longer hummed with other people's presence, I opened a drawer and found the blue kettle she had promised to take, and I laughed in a long, quiet way at the absurdity of domestic rituals. How even before everything collapsed there were habits tied to objects. And I realized that reclaiming the ordinary was, in its own stubborn way, a kind of victory because it meant the little patterns that make life livable were no longer being overwritten by performance. Yet satisfaction lived cheek by jowl with loneliness. In claiming the record, I had also claimed a narrower social map, and evenings that had once been shared with someone to whom I would narrate trivialities were now occupied by longer, more solitary reflections in which I would think through what had been taken and what had been returned. And in those reflective hours I felt a complicated pride, not a triumph in causing pain, but the sober knowledge that I had removed a recurring theft from my life, that I had converted suspicion into clarity, and that clarity, even when costly, is a currency in itself. There were unexpected consequences that surprised me with their human weight. A cousin who had been critical at first sent a long, thoughtful message weeks later describing how, after reading the folder and then watching for themselves in private, they had realized the revelation had allowed their own family to talk about their secrets with more honesty. And the message closed with a sentence about how painful though truth may be, it sometimes permits people to stop performing and start healing. Which was not the revenge I had planned, but a strange after-effect that softened the sharp edges of my actions. Conversely, a friend who had been vocally supportive in long social media posts later confessed in a paragraph of private messages that they had felt uneasy about the public nature of what I had done, worried that the humiliation could be sharper than necessary. And that admission put me back in touch with the fact that exposure is a tool with unpredictable dynamics. And in admitting that I felt both the warmth of validation and the prickle of doubt, and I had to live with both. Months passed, and we moved through the formalities of deciding what, if anything, of the life we had shared could be rebuilt, and in a mediated conversation held under polite, neutral light, where both of us spoke in long, measured sentences about boundaries and the potential for future contact, she said, in a careful monologue that mixed regret and a thin thread of hope, that perhaps in time she might find a way to live honestly, and that she wanted to do the work necessary to not perform truth, but to live it. And when I replied in a long, honest sentence that thanked her for the honesty and asked for time and distance to allow both of us to rebuild, I felt a clarity that was not triumph but a pragmatic acceptance. We had closed one chapter without screaming, and now the work of separate lives, with their own small dignities and repairs, had to begin. If someone asks me now whether I regret the way I exposed her, my answer comes in long, deliberate phrases because regret is not a neat thing, and because the ledger I compiled did, in its quiet way, give me back some time and dignity that had been quietly siphoned from my life. Yet the exposure also carved scars into relationships that I had not anticipated and taught me that the act of revealing truth carries responsibilities I had not fully reckoned with until I saw how relatives and friends rearranged themselves in the aftermath. And so I say that I do not regret seeking the truth, and laying it before witnesses because living inside a lie felt like slow theft. But I also acknowledge with a heavy, sincere tone that revealing the truth publicly is a blunt instrument that demands humility and a readiness to live with the social and emotional residues it leaves behind. And in that admission, there is neither self-flagellation nor triumphalism, only the sober knowledge that I did what I thought I had to do, that it changed people and patterns in ways I both wanted and did not want, and that the only thing left now is the slow, necessary work of rebuilding a life that rests on what we can prove and what we choose to carry forward.